Lewis and Clark had been sent to Philadelphia. They'd been trained in cholera vaccination for Indians by Benjamin Rush. They'd been instructed in map making, in astronomy, in Indian languages, in agriculture and botany of all kinds. They'd been given a thorough Enlightenment training. It was, in fact, the greatest Enlightenment project ever conceived, and on the day of the Louisiana Purchase announcement, as he sent them out, Jefferson was able to tell them, when you treat with and deal with the Indian monarchs and leaders who you will meet, and I urge you to treat with them with great respect, you will be able to tell them they already live in the United States. They owe no further allegiance to any empire, or any emperor, or any European monarch. And at that point it's become very clear that we will one day be sitting in La Jolla discussing this question. I can't say on the head of revolution that everything is positive or as intelligent. For example, the other great revolution inspired by American and French ideas in the hemisphere was the revolution in Haiti. I'm sure that Dennis will sell you, or if you can't do that, will lend you a copy of C.L.R. James's magnificent book, Black Jacobins.
I've had it.
The greatest.
I also have his book on cricket.
Excellent. He was the greatest writer from Trinidad ever produced, greater than my Paul, in my opinion. By far the best writer on cricket, and the great historian of the first black revolution and first black slave republic in history, which, under the slogans of liberté, égalité, fraternité, destroyed a French fleet and a French army and ruined Napoleon's plans for the region. Jefferson dreaded this revolution because he thought it was a slave revolt that could spread to the Carolinas and to Georgia, but it was in fact that revolution that so broke Napoleon's will that he was willing to sell Louisiana. So everyone here owes a debt that they probably don't acknowledge, and I bet have not been taught in school, to the slave rebels of Haiti, without whom revolutionary ideas would not have spread to the point where the United States could have been born. This is what it is to study history. This is what it is to understand dialectics, it seems to me. Nation building, war, revolution, yeah, I've at least touched on them. And the Enlightenment. Now, one can't now avoid the question of slavery. At every step of this extraordinary business. Oh, and I should just mention one more thing. Jefferson is the first president to send the United States to war. He's been brooding for 20 years on the necessity to punish the Barbary states of North Africa, as they're vulgarly known. That's to say the member states of the Ottoman Empire on the west coast of Africa, now known as Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya, who supplied themselves and kept themselves going by the forcible impressment of sailors, the kidnapping of slaves, and the capturing of ships and cargoes. The best modern historians now estimate that between about 1650 and 1812, upwards of 1.5 million European and American slaves were taken by this system, which justified itself from the Quran. It said we are entitled to enslave infidels and to take their property, and kept in the most appalling conditions, and of course negated, prohibited free trade in the Atlantic approaches, Straits of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean. Jefferson had wanted for many, many years to put an end to this system, and as soon as he was president, again without consulting Congress, sent the fleet and told them to bombard the Barbary capital cities until they gave it up, which they did. He didn't tell Congress until the fleet was so far away that it was beyond recall. It wasn't exactly a regime change policy, but it was a regime behavior modification policy. And meant that by the time of the War of 1812, there was a serious American Navy capable of taking on real enemies in distant waters. And of course, as you probably all do know, it was the first time the US Marine Corps was ever sent overseas, and that's why the first line of the Marine anthem is from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. And I mention it because that was at least one slave trade that Jefferson put down. We can thank him for that much. But at every other stage of the career I've just been very, very briefly sketching, the original sin, the taint, the stain of slavery is present at all times. It means that the Great Enlightenment document, the Declaration of Independence, which first says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and first proposes the idea of the consent of the governed, which is why we can link Jefferson's name to the word democracy, is maimed even as it's being written, because the paragraphs that Jefferson wrote saying that slavery should not be legal in the United States were struck out in committee, because without the slave states of Carolina and the Georgias and the slave traders of Connecticut and New York, consensus could not be achieved. So at the very beginning of the United States, there's an original sin, and the Enlightenment project is negated. When Jefferson purchases Louisiana, an idea that he may well have got from Thomas Paine, who had certainly been a long advocate of it, Thomas Paine and Joel Barlow and other friends of his go to him and they say, Mr. President, we can start again now. We've doubled the size of the country, at 10 cents an acre at that. We can begin again without slavery. Don't import any slaves to Louisiana, Mr. President. Don't do it. Send instead some thrifty German settlers and farmers. They'll make this desert bloom. But Jefferson is in such a hurry to get the sugarcane cut, that the sugarcane economy back on its feet to compete with other Caribbean powers. He says, no, we have to have slaves right away. And so slaves begin to be unloaded at New Orleans, and there is no new beginning, and everything is ruined. Just as those who believe that all labor-saving new modern devices were part of the Enlightenment failed to notice that Mr. Eli Whitney's cotton gin was going to prolong the cotton economy and make it more profitable and more labor-intensive and more durable and more extended. So it isn't just that Jefferson fails to abolish slavery, it's that he extends it, deepens it, prolongs it. And because of the new states that are carved and cloned from the Louisiana Territory, gifts to the next generation approximately 50-50 slave and free states, which means that there's going to be a terrible war. And as Mr. Lincoln later was to say, and the war came. It's Stein also, not just on his nation building, not just on his Enlightenment project, not just to comment on his war policy, not just to comment on his brilliant handling of foreign policy, but it's also Stein, as everybody now knows, on his own private life. People may differ as to whether it was nastier of him to screw Sally Hemings or to own her. I think owning her was worse, myself, but the moralists would say that having sex with her was worse than owning her. Whichever it is, and she was his wife's half-sister at that, so you know what life was like down on the old Charlottesville plantation. His wife and his mistress had the same father. That's why I return you to where I began. The descendants of that relationship now live among us happily and as free citizens. The one thing Jefferson never believed could happen. Actually, Sally Hemings and all her children passed as white in the census of 1830. And you can get a wonderful book now, pictures of all the descendants from both sides of Jefferson's family. But we have not, I think, by any means reached the point where these matters don't have to trouble us anymore. So, distrustful though I am of the idea that the personal is political, normally whenever anyone says that, you know there's some hysterical bullshit about to follow. There is a sense in which it is true, and there is a sense in which, yes, this story, the story of Thomas Jefferson, is about you, is about all of us, and will stay with us for the rest of our days. And so with that, I'm very grateful for your coming, and I'm all yours. Thank you.
I'm sure there are many questions. I have a question, Christopher.
Sir?
Yes, do light up and use one of those mugs as a ashtray.
Not the one with the whiskey in it.
Or flip it, no. Or flip it on the floor. Inasmuch as we live in a science-rich environment here in La Jolla with the Neurosciences Institute, the Salk Institute, etc., can you expound to a further extent on the relationship between Dr. Benjamin Rush, Dr. Joseph Priestley, and others in the American Philosophical Society from Philadelphia, and Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson's interest in science?
Yes.
And vaccination.
I hope the question was audible to all, was it?
Oh, yes.
I could ventriloquize Comrade Wills, perhaps. Well, he wanted to have me say a little more about Jefferson as a scientist, especially given the scientific character and quality of the Greater La Jolla area, and the scientific character of the Enlightenment in Philadelphia. Well, Jefferson designed his own plow, one that would turn the soil deeper and better and faster. He spent a lot of his time trying to bring Virginia wines up to snuff with graftings and cuttings. Still hasn't quite worked, but it's a lot better than the Connecticut Chardonnay, I can tell you that.